And so hello and welcome everyone. I'm Peter Robinson and this is the Ethereum Engineering Group meetup. And this is the 100th meetup. So we've had 100 different meetups over 4 and a bit years. And the one meetup that we said we would never do was, is ETH going to go up? So this isn't, is ETH going to go up? This is how to think about crypto and everything and pricing and cryptoeconomics. And I searched around for someone who I thought was a credible person to talk about it. And I came across Lex, who is awesome. And so Lex, I'll let you introduce yourself. And then once you've introduced yourself, please share your slides and tell us all about cryptoeconomics.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to have your attention. I have a lot of slides. That's a personal weakness, so that's the first thing I'll let you know about myself. I think we'll cover what we cover, and then it'll be wonderful if we have some time to chat. And if we don't, I'm always happy to connect.
Oh, look, shut the fuck up, yeah.
That's great. Okay, I'll take that as enthusiasm. So my background is some combination of tech and finance and visual arts for a while, which is a strange combination, but makes it, being here in our space, really satisfying to be able to bring lots of things together. I had a great time at Lehman Brothers during the collapse of the 2008 markets, which early on taught me to enjoy volatility and creative destruction, and then also gave permission to become an entrepreneur. And so I built out.
I'll deal with muting people.
Thank you so much. Anyway, long story short, I came to Consensus about 3 years ago and focused on Nick, you're having you're infected by a robot that wants to just
there's one who goes
Mario
off
good
mute,
time.
and then by the time I get around to turning done.
Oh, fuck off, Matthew. Fucking snitch.
Okay, I'll set up the just a sec. We'll enable waiting room and eject people.
I'll put you in the waiting room, Peter. Yep.
All right. So, yeah, I think you can go ahead. How's that? We've not had people who've been interrupting previously, but anyway. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Fantastic experience. Okay. All right. So I'll hop into the slides. Can folks see my screen? Yeah. Yes, works. Okay, great. Right.
So did you know that you can go into presentation mode?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that.
So it's
let's
yeah, just go with what that.
Yeah, I'll go with what we got. All right. Because I got a little bit of lag on my side. Okay, so what we're gonna go through today is a bunch of stuff, starting with, what are the different things that can impact just even the idea of prices? What are prices? How do you build to it? And the last thing I want to do is answer that question directly, because the trading answer to the question is going to be in many ways kind of uninteresting, or is going to be very reflexive. It's going to revolve a lot about what other people.
Shut the fuck up, you cunt!
That is Io Musa. If we could get rid of,
Gotcha, bitch.
please.
Gotcha, bitch.
It's
There
amazing.
you go. Yeah, I know it is. I mean, we've had a few. The time we had Vitalik on, we had a heckler or someone who was trying to do self-promotion come heckling. But yeah, this is, I guess, cryptocurrency pricing and crypto economics is a new area of heckling. Anyway, congratulations, Lex.
Yeah, no, I feel honored by the effort. Okay, so we'll talk about token engineering, which is one of the practices in the cryptoeconomics team, and then we'll walk through kind of a substantive view of global macro and the crypto macro, and then kind of land on fundamentals. And there's a really tight connection between all this stuff, which is why I want to go broad and cover it. So when we started thinking about the sessions, like it started with Peter's questions of like what drives crypto prices, and then it goes into what's a good mental model, and then you start getting into what if this happened and what if that happened, and kind of what are the effects of the micro pieces. And so part of the structure of the answer is basically the questions, right? The questions show you that all this information is accrued from all over the different parts of the context, the economy, the markets, what people are building, and they roll up to this indicator, which is the price. And the price is just an agreement of supply and demand for holding that asset. And it's both a distraction and not the truth, in the sense that it's just an approximation of lots of things at one time, but it's also the truth, and it is also the correct answer, in the sense that it's the best approximation we have at that moment. And where it can get confusing is that people start thinking about the components of different prices and what flows into them, whether it's sentiment, whether it's fundamentals, whether it's memes, whether it is how many troll bots you've got, and all of that. And it's very hard in different spaces to understand the market structure and what it is that's underneath the clearing price that you see. The quality of the price might be different depending on sort of what markets you're in. So that's the structure of the questions. And then just in terms of the crypto econ team, and part of how I'm answering this question is I think three practices as it comes to Web3. And the three practices are, is the token engineering, and that definitely connects into protocol design, but it also connects into sort of applications and NFTs and things that are a little bit more mushy than strictly mathematical approaches. And then that's your product, which then connects into investment strategy, which gets into asset allocation, macroeconomic views, actually trying to get to a financial valuation. And then finally, the last bit is participation in Web3, using the financial instruments and the financial objects that you own within the investment strategy. And of course, Web3 participation through DAOs or through governance or whatever connects back to token engineering. So you have kind of a loop between these three different functions. And so this is how we're structured, but we're structured this way because I think when you look at any particular project or protocol or asset or whatever it is in Web3, you have to apply each one of these lenses to kind of try again to get to a better underlying truth. So I'll start with token engineering. And my guess is that for most folks here, this is the most familiar and going to be the most basic. And I think it's still important to talk about some of the distinctions that we find useful as mental models. And we don't always have expert audiences, so I harp on a couple of different points. The first point is equivocation, is that when people refer to tokens, they don't say things that are specific or particularly meaningful. They use the word token to refer to different things, and then that creates kind of cognitive errors about logic, because you're using words as if they were interchangeable, but they are in fact referring to different underlying truths, right? So equivocation is alternating between different meanings of a word in an argument's premises. So the example is taxes are a headache, painkillers make a headache go away, therefore painkillers will make taxes go away, right? If we don't know what our words mean, then we're not talking about the same thing, and I bet if you talk about the Ethereum token versus if you talk about, let's say, the friends with benefits token, there's a lot of difference in terms of what the word token even means. And in many ways, the token is just a hyperlink for referring to some other fundamental truth. And so, the very first thing that we try to do when we think about tokens, there's a lot of stuff on here because it's meant to show that there's a lot of stuff to think about, is that tokens are an output, or they're a solution to some particular problem, and that some particular problem needs to have a definition. And the definition is really kind of like it removes equivocation, right? So I want to create the best real world social networks for the coolest celebrities is quite different from I want to create a computational chain that's faster and cheaper than Ethereum, but uses decentralization properties, for example. And so we go through a lot of bottoms up kind of micro work to pull apart what the definition is in order to get to the answer of what a token is. And that gets us to trying to compare economic systems, right? So we try to map where an asset lives, whatever that asset's price is, but where it lives relative to things that people know, because it's fun to use wizard words in crypto. It's fun to use sort of obfuscation in order to make things mysterious and expensive and to kind of make it all a big game. But of course, a lot of the patterns that people go through are they're repeatable. They are timeless. So if you rewind back 1,000 years, you would still have economies, you would still have human organizations, you would still have standards and protocols for exchange, you would still have customers and investors and so on and so forth. And so, we try to map in a flow where the problem sits within an economy, within the sort of theory of the firm and digital goods and services, and how those map to whatever the digital object or the digital asset looks like. And so this actually is, this chart is one of our fundamental insights, and it is probably one of the most obvious insights you can have, and I'm sure everybody here understands it. But to pull apart that equivocation of like a token is a token, and therefore its price should behave similarly depending on, you can compare all of this stuff together, is really pulling apart what the different types are. And so at the very bottom layer, you've got something like a computational blockchain, like a mathematical network. And it's not just the layer one type of concept. It's more of this has to be a strictly rigorous, mechanistic, mathematical sort of machine that generates, that functions because there's a token in it, and the token is a function of the machine and how everybody uses the machine, but it is entirely algorithmic, right? So it is, this is designing the cathedral. You sort of, you can't be wishy-washy about how the mathematics of a computational blockchain work. You can't not have clear and rigorous mechanism design for the graph or for Filecoin and so on. And so this is one category. A category on top is something, the words are mushy, but something like a decentralized protocol where there's a series of different smart contracts sitting on the computational platform, and the smart contracts sometimes connect, sometimes don't connect. They might switch between different versions, but there is a computational part, there's a mechanistic part, but there's also looser design. So for example, a a bunch of the tokens can be sitting in a treasury, and a group of people might be using incentives to do liquidity farming or to do lending farming or something of that nature. You might have human decision making in which version is what, and that might be operated much more like a startup than a decentralized network. And so these things also mush together into platforms where you might have a Web2 experience or more of a company framework that provides an interface that connects to the decentralized protocols underneath. And so activity on that platform might be incentivized by the token, right? So there are projects that only operate as platforms, and they connect to other decentralized protocols, and they might use tokens as juice inside of the platform to get people to do stuff. And so the quality and what makes things valuable is different depending where you are in that schema. And then you can still go a higher level up, right? So for example, participants who are subject to some particular roles inside of a platform, again, soft or hard. And then you might have broad retail, which interact with digital assets or digital objects, and again, participate within the incentives. And then you might have the actual digital asset or object also to contain tokenomics. So a lot of the interesting art from PAC, for example, has things that crowds can do in order to change the nature to change the tokenomics of the actual NFT. So you might build into the objects experiences and functionalities that actually don't connect all the way down. So each of these it's important to pull apart, because each of these is priced and matters in a different way, and has kind of different reasons for its fundamentals. Then the other thing to overlay on top is that there are things that are inside tokens. So endogenous, so things that are inside the platform or the protocol that you design as kind of strict rules, right? So minting, burning, staking, locking, whatever, inflation, algorithmic things that are inside of the machine. And so this is like a player interacting with an environment. This is your attempted economic use case. And then there are things that happen outside, right? So everything is situated in an exogenous environment where there's secondary market activities, where there's market structure, there's derivatives, there's immediately things that people do to your token that you might not want, and in crypto, not all, but a lot, I would say probably more than half of the impact on how your asset behaves is the things that you can't control, that don't have anything to do with the design of the machine that you put together, and are largely driven by your relationships with others, and in particular with the market structure of the overall ecosystem. This we can skip over, and then finally, like why to go through that, and the answer is that you can look at the category of token, right? Whether it's a mechanistic L1 with some objective function you're solving for rigorously, or whether it's something that's much more hybrid, where there's cash flow and governance, and the cash flow kind of flows back up into the DAO, something like Aave, but then governance can direct incentives, or whether it's something that's completely community focused and fashion focused, right? So friends with benefits, for example, where you have governance and you have a social token, but you don't have really a machine underneath. And you can see things of the nature of like, Constitution DAO as well, or the syndicates, things of that type. And it's very hard for us where we sit today, which is with a short market history, with a lot of speculation in the space and a lot of emotions, to have a statistically provable hypothesis about what creates value. Generally speaking, I think we can say that a mechanistic L1 on average is is a good idea from a cryptoeconomic perspective. Like generally, these things become more valuable over time if they're strictly rigorously designed. I think with the other categories, there's still a lot of room and market cycles that we need to go through before it becomes obvious the way in which tokens connect to value. And I think, a lot of the hybrid protocols look like startups and applications, and people use startup evaluation techniques in order to think about, how much revenue does Aave versus Compound have, or, Uniswap versus something else, or how many assets does Anchor have, that kind of rubric. But I don't think we yet have a really clear connector about how good token design connects to the value of the token there yet. And then, of course, for community DAOs, we are in a moment in the cycle where experimentation is very highly valued. And so I think, again, we're going to need to have some distance before we know exactly how good DAO and community strategy looks like before we can say this is repeatable. Okay. So the part of the point here, right, is we went very micro. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, this is nice. Like, it's nice to have views about what's right or what's fundamental or how to try and control the world. But in reality is you're a tiny, tiny boat floating around in a giant ocean. And the giant ocean is full of tsunamis and asteroids. And the asteroids don't care at all about how good your fundamental twiddling is in whatever model. And that is why for us at Consensus, and then more generally for me as a person, and for anyone, I think, in the crypto world, everyone is an amateur, macroeconomist and fundamental investor and so on. And by everyone, I don't mean everyone, just people who are kind of obsessed with this slice of the world, is that you really need to understand the context within which your assets are floating around. And the reason is the technology is so fundamentally economic that, and its value proposition is so fundamentally economic that not understanding the economic context means you're going to be surprised all the time by the things that are happening with you. Okay, so that's a lead into the importance of context. And here is a simple and probably incorrect logic model, but I find it useful as to understanding the general flow of assets. And so the first piece is global macro, which means how does the world look? And there are two versions of the world, if you simplify it into black and white, and those are risk on and risk off. So you might know that in the last couple of decades, things have become more and more correlated. So traditionally, equities and fixed income are supposed to move in different directions. Now they don't really. We know that crypto is supposed to be uncorrelated from traditional markets. The answer is not really, right? So there's such a design of our economic systems that the risk on regime and the risk off regime tend to be very large switches. And when things are risk off, a lot of things are correlated underneath in order to create that environment. And so from the macro positioning comes the crypto macro positioning, which is how much money is flowing into Bitcoin, how much money is flowing into Web3. So, the layer ones, and then down and down and down, right? So these days there's independent money flowing into NFTs rather than just allocation to Ethereum. But we can think of this as just inflows as a rate of change. And out of that, we get to capital gains or capital losses. So there's some experience that investors have in the second bucket. And if there's capital gains, then you start seeing lots of risk chasing behavior on the right, which is things like funding startups and seed startups, using DeFi to create leverage, generating new projects, more people seeing returns and therefore using these projects, going onto every growth protocol and trying to yield farm and generating capital gains. And then that kind of cycles in a positive way together to create more and more, let's call it innovation, but generally we can just say novelty seeking or risk seeking on the right. And of course, when you have capital losses in this process, it unwinds, right? So it goes the other way. It can slow down the cycle on the right. And then if any of the buckets on the left are negatively influenced, so for example, we go into a risk-off world, or instead of capital gains, investors experience lots of capital losses, you're not going to have flows into the right. You're not going to have as much risk-seeking behavior. Okay, so that's the overall premise as to why we should pay attention to the overall structure of the markets. Now, I'm going to go through a lot of slides fairly quickly just to give you a flavor of where I think we are today. Okay, we'll skip over that. So for today, which is March, we look at kind of four ideas. We look at here what's called model revenue, but basically where we are in the regime or the cycle relative to prior cycles. Then we look. So that's what this chart is. You'll see basically the yellow lines where we are, the red line or the blue line is the prior cycle overlaid. So we're kind of in the middle-ish of the previous experience, and roughly speaking, it's not so bad. So that's what gives us the orange here as a warning. Then we look at global macro, which is the overall flavor of the world, and you can see that between January to March, we believe that global macro has gotten quite a bit worse from orange to red. Then we look at crypto as an asset class itself, which is we have a warning sign on, and then we look at indicators inside of Web3, right? So we go back to fundamentals and try to see how things are in that category. Okay, so here we go. Geopolitical risk. So geopolitical risk, you can see the chart here. It's a chart from BlackRock, obviously quite bad. So we're at about the same place as when COVID was declared a global pandemic and we went into a shutdown. And this is, of course, for obvious reasons. The obvious reasons are the Russian invasion into Ukraine. If we look at the economic, the human damage of the war is obvious. The economic damage is emerging. The ruble collapsing 70%. The Russian balance sheet outside of gold, basically Russia's discovered that it doesn't own its assets. It can't control them because they're in European banks. The exclusion from SWIFT shuts down the payment rails and the ability to participate in the global economy. Banking system in Russia is collapsing. So their banks, large banks, are just going bankrupt and defaulting on their debt. And then Western tech is exiting and has exited the Russian market, right? So the geopolitical risk very closely connects into the economic fallout. And then you can see here on the left, the 600 billion of the Russian central bank balance sheet. You can see basically the dollar reserves and the euro reserves. Those are essentially not available to the country. Now, the interesting question is China, with its $3 trillion balance sheet, how does it think about where it keeps the euro or the dollar position that it has? Does it have custody of its assets or not? So that's an interesting rhetorical question. Sanctions have increased over the last 20 years dramatically. So you can see here US sanctions since 2000 being essentially used as a tool of economic and political control. And so, from that end, we can see that Russia's in a bad place, but at the same time, the energy markets are in crisis. And what this chart shows is the delta between capacity to produce energy in the West versus the consumption that's necessary. And basically, there's a huge gap that can't be quickly filled. And if you look at Europe, of course, Europe is very reliant on Russian oil. And so that generates the cash in order to continue to finance aggression. And so you can obviously see how that generates instability in those economic ties and potentially disastrous outcomes for the economy. And so this chart is this is a really interesting chart, which shows you that every time there is a spike in energy prices, the way that there is now, there's a high probability of a recession coming. And so every time it's circled in red, and then you see the gray bars, you're entering a recession. And so, you know, this to us signals that a recession is really, really likely. There was a story in sort of the financial media about how inflation wasn't like real. You can see this on the left. You see the inflation spike over here, and then low inflation for a really, really long time. And so the story was that inflation was transitory, that it wasn't caused by the Federal Reserve printing whatever it was, $6 trillion, that went into prices of only assets, but rather that inflation would go away after the COVID supply chain challenges would stop. Pretty obviously, supply chains aren't going to be better in the middle of a global war with oil spikes and geopolitical instability. And so this sort of transitory story is gone, right? So the world is now watching for persistent high inflation, especially on the side of manufacturing and production. And that in turn leads to slower global growth. And slow global growth is also happening in the context of the central banks all over the world having less and less capability to correct slow growth. And so what you see in this chart is the US interest rate, and all over the world, generally speaking, you know, there are similar dynamics where since the 80s, the peak, the highest rates keep going lower and lower and lower. And so what that means is that when you need to drop rates, you need to make money cheaper, you need to make it easier to create economic growth, you have less and less room to actually do that. And that's where we are now. There's very little wiggle room for central banks to underwrite, to finance growth during a contraction, because rates are nominal rates are under 2% and real rates are negative. And so we have this sort of two hit from global growth slowing down and then fewer things that central banks can do. And so the result of this is a recalibration of the price of risk assets. So what are risk assets? Risk assets are things like equities, of all kinds in every jurisdiction. Risk assets are also, as you see on the right, Bitcoin and Ethereum. And then risk off assets, things that you buy during an environment where the economy is contracting, right, are things like energy, metals, commodities, you know, things that become more, that are inflation hedges. And there's a lot to say about whether Bitcoin's an inflation hedge. It's not a particularly interesting conversation, I think, but at this particular point of time, Bitcoin did experience a collapse in value, or a recalibration during the kind of the shift to risk off. Doesn't mean it won't go up again. It just means that in this particular moment, it's being treated as a risk off, or sorry, it's being treated as a risk on asset. Okay, so all of this, right, is a lot of slides. What's the point? The point is, before the Russian invasion, markets were pricing slower growth and tighter financial condition, higher inflation. With the invasion, that's accelerated. So we're going to have high inflation, lower growth, and the inflation's not transitory. Monetary policy is less effective because there's not so much stuff to do. And the energy bit is a real problem for governments that have to manage kind of populist backlash. And so in the short term, this is painful for everyone, and it's painful for crypto. In the long term, there are some interesting lessons at the nation state level. And the lessons for nation states is that you don't actually have custody of your assets, and they can be seized from you, even if you're a central bank of a nuclear power. And I think for the secular crypto adoption story, that's a positive, despite it being extremely unpleasant in the short term. Okay. So now we're going to switch tracks and look at closer to our industry. And again, we're going to use a bunch of financial tools still, but we're now looking at crypto. And in particular, we're starting to look at the big currencies. This chart shows you correlation between Ethereum, Bitcoin, and the S&P being stocks. So if the wiggly line is all the way to the top, or if the wiggly line is all the way to the bottom, that means either positive or negative correlation of 1. If the wiggly line is inside of the blue band, that would suggest there's no correlation. It means that ETH and Bitcoin are independent of stories about stocks. And generally speaking, it has not been true that crypto has been uncorrelated from equities, that things have traveled together with occasional kind of disconnects, but negative correlation is the same thing as positive correlation, right? It's the zero that matters, and we're not in that regime. If we look at the store of value thesis, it's been a bit challenged this year. On the left, what you see is the gold ETF in blue, which has basically been which looks a lot like inflation, and then you see the experience of ETH and Bitcoin underneath, which is a lot less clearly acting as an inflation hedge. If we look at the valuation of Bitcoin in particular, I know it's impossible to read this slide, but for those of you that have a PDF, you can click on the source. That'll take you to the underlying. Essentially, the answer here is that based on historic value of transactions within Bitcoin, so how many transactions are there relative to the network value, the current price is sort of fair, and there is potential room to fall a bit more, in the sense of if people are feeling bearish, there's room to fall. There's also lots of room to correct up. So there's a big range in both directions, but it's not extremely obvious that on the fundamentals the price is wrong for where we are at the moment. If we look at institutional flows, large funds are still putting money in. So in February, there was a $300 million worth of inflows into things like Grayscale and CoinShares. So the traditional fund vehicles, and that's what you see on the chart on the left. These institutional flows usually means price goes up because it's supply and demand. So more flows in means more demand for a fixed supply, generally speaking. So we look at this demand side, and we look at it as a measure of sentiment by the finance industry. Notably, the finance industry is a lot slower to come in. So it's potentially path dependency from investment decisions that were made in the past. And then if we go from kind of the supply and demand at the crypto level, and we start looking at Web3 in particular, we can start parsing out the different parts of the ecosystem and their health. So for example, something like stable coins, are they functioning? So there's about $180 billion worth of stable coins. Most of the growth is coming in from USDC, from the Coinbase Circle coin, but it's flattened out. The growth would come from people entering the space, and given the current levels, it's flattened out quite a bit. But everything is, I would say, working. So here we think we're pretty comfortable with the state of the world. The pegs, generally speaking, remain stable. No big failure within the crypto dollar. Total value locked, however, is quite volatile, and this number's changed a lot in the last month. In particular, we know that, but it is volatile, and there was quite a big collapse since the start of the year in the value of value locked, even though DeFi wallets continued to increase in a pretty straight line. And this is a really important dynamic that goes back to the earlier mental model I shared about what experience are people having, right? So they're joining the space, but essentially they're experiencing capital loss. And that colors a lot, I think, for what we're going to see over the next few months, maybe longer, right? So we see a drop in the value of deposits on lending protocols. We see a drop in loans, right? So deleveraging as volatility makes people lose money. And so that is consistent with risk-off behavior. People are going into cash because they're scared, or because they're just adjusting to a different atmosphere, a different context. The trading activity is better than last year, but also not exponentially larger than last year. And the rate of growth is the rate of change is what matters. And so if there's an impression of slowdown, that generates an impression of like a bear market. And so we see DEX activity being flat or slightly up. And, the result of all this is that financial activity overall has performed worse than the performance of layer ones, right? So Ethereum itself, or things like Polygon or other scaling solutions or dare I say the word Solana, they have outperformed the applications, the financial applications that sit on top of, that sit inside of the economy, right? That are the platforms. And so again, the thing I worry about is that the experience that people are having after adopting Web3, whether it is, buying NFTs or whether it's participating in DeFi, is a bad experience, that they're experiencing capital loss this year. And given the staggering number of new users, that might be a reputational issue. If we look at NFTs, there's a similar story in that the NFT hype of early 2022, which saw just a tremendous spike in cultural relevance, is subsiding. This is Google search volume for NFT, DeFi, and Ethereum. At one point, NFT surpassing searches for Ethereum globally. And we can read this in different ways. We can say, oh, this is bad, people aren't trying to buy NFTs. Alternately, we could say people finally understand what they are. So potentially this is an adoption curve issue rather than a sentiment issue. But again, we can't just rely on NFTs to carry us forward. And if you look into trading and trends inside of volume and sales across art as well as gaming, what you'll see is the numbers are, they're either down or they're flat. The quality of the numbers is hard to parse, but I think we're getting to an equilibrium again that reflects the more risk off position that folks are taking, rather than just jumping in and buying all sorts of random stuff hoping it goes up. So again, that was a ton of information. There are some kind of core takeaways that I'll tie back to the beginning, which is crypto is tied to traditional markets and geopolitical events. That's the ocean in which we swim, because we are building economic systems that bridge and interconnect into other assets. Will crypto be part of commodities, or will it be part of venture capital or sort of technology growth? Those are performing very differently. And right now, crypto is performing much more like early stage technology. That makes it challenging relative to the gold theme, although that's a short-term issue, not a long-term issue. We've already talked about we've already talked about central banks and the sanctions being potentially positive over the long term for permissionless assets, especially at the nation state level. But that's a dual-edged sword in the sense, for example, Biden's executive order, the word national security is repeated there quite a few numbers of times. And so we will have more scrutiny, we'll have more government intervention, we'll have lots of existential hand-wringing, but I think in the very long run, this is positive for us, especially as nation states try to dig out of their policy issues by printing lots more money, which again will drive people to the open source financial system. So what we went through a micro story about how to design tokens and how tokens are different depending on different theme. Then we anchored that into the broader context of where the world is. And then we talked about some particular fundamentals within Web3 right now that are showing kind of a little bit of slowing in the underlying performance of things. But again, just pointing to the fact, and I'll bring this up again because I think it's important to have context, where we are in the cycle, in the market cycle, right? So if this was the prior market cycle, the red line, and then the yellow is the current market cycle, all things considered, we're still in pretty positive territory, and it's a fantastic time to be raising money, to be building, and to be focusing on customers. And with that, I'm going to pause for questions.
So please, Richard, fire away.
Can I ask, Alex, that was great, thank you. Just, do you see Ethereum and Bitcoin as loosely correlated now? One of your charts seemed to show them quite apart, but I mean, they seem to be correlated. They seem to move in basically the same direction. But do you ever see them decoupling, and what would cause that to happen?
Yeah, so this is a chart for this year on the left. If you can tell the difference between their movements, more power to you. To me, it seems like the same.
It looked like there was another one that you had which showed a little further on, but
yeah. So there's this, right? This is correlations to the public markets.
Yeah.
So it's gray and yellow. Yeah. So for example, this they start looking more and more alike. When they get to similar sizes. So there's an effect of earlier on in its life, Ethereum was smaller, so it would be a lot more jittery and a lot more sensitive to lots of different things. And so the larger ETH gets, the more it will correlate to Bitcoin, because the demand for both assets will come from the same place, which is Bitcoin and ETH are both safe havens for family offices or hedge funds, and they'll go into those assets equally because both assets will be able to absorb large investment checks. So that will increase correlation. What will decrease correlation is Web3. So to the extent that there are things that are, fundamental trends like NFTs and metaverse stuff and pay to earn game economies, right? That shouldn't benefit Bitcoin, while it should benefit all the Web3 names, and certainly ETH would be part of that. But I wouldn't say that. I don't think the outside world really understands yet the difference between Web3 and crypto, and I think that'll take a few years to articulate.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the old flippening that was going to be happening years ago didn't ever happen, and it's still, that's right, it's still a herd kind of thing that seems to drive it. So it's not it's not like econs are driving it, it's humans that are driving this thing along, really. And it's the old FOMO probably is the whole, thing that seems to drive it. So
Yeah.
I wonder when it will happen. I guess when people become more sophisticated in what's happened, what they're understanding.
Yeah. At the same time, I don't think there's a particular value or like, I don't know if we need to aspire to a place where I think aspiring for some version of quote unquote fundamentals to drive some version of financial prices, in particular in this type of market, is not that it's unrealistic. It's just it's not the market structure, right? The market caps of things are still too small. Like large financial investors can move the price of anything and everything. It's a very inefficient market for big holders. So I think it's all right as long as we just understand the water in which we swim.
Yeah.
So Brendan Muscat's got a question in the chat there. Do you think the merge will have any impact on prices?
Yeah, let me try to take that and the second one too. So just take this as opinion and nothing else, because it's impossible, I think, to have a rigorous opinion on it. I think the merge will have an impact on prices. I don't think it's because of the merge. I think it's because of the stories we tell to each other about the merge. So I think the myth of it, the meme of now it's not inflationary anymore, the ability to share charts about how much stuff is burnt, and I think that will increase prices, not some mechanical outcome of the merge. I'll give you an example that no one will like. Binance 4 years ago, or whenever they launched their token, had a story about how, we buy back our token and burn it. And the actual amount of token they bought and burned was not meaningful to the overall market. But if you looked at what people would say all the time, they would just repeat how Binance buys back the token and burns it. And that was important as a story. I think the other story about, now with Ethereum is ESG, I think that's a powerful story again. I don't know if it's fundamental or sentiment, but the stories that people tell each other matter, especially in crypto protocols. I think in regards to Bitcoin and halving events, generally speaking, yes, it's worked in the past. The price has tracked the halving events. If you have perfect information in financial markets, for example, if a company is going to issue a dividend or split its stock, the rational answer is that doesn't matter because I know about it ahead of time, and so that should be priced into the price already. However, our markets are inefficient, and indeed the price moves as a result. I think the one place I kind of disagree with that model, or I pause on it, is so you've got supply and demand, right? And the halving stuff has to do with supply of Bitcoin. So if you think something will be more valuable because there's less of it, what you're doing is you're holding demand constant. You're saying there's infinite demand and there's finite supply, and supply changes and therefore price changes. You could also have the whole thing collapse on the other side. You could be like, okay, well, there's less supply, but now demand is falling 70% for some particular reason, right? So that's the one thing that is important to watch, and that's why we watch the institutional flows in, because that's the demand side.
I think there's one other question, though. I am aware that when I was negotiating your time with your PA, she said, read my lips, 41 hour. So I know we're 5 minutes over now. So yeah, and I can see we've got one last question. I know I've got a question I'd love to ask, but I think we've run out.
Let's do one more.
We'll do.
We'll do two.
We'll do two. So there's one by. I'm going to butcher your name, Hao Min Louis, and there's a 4-year cycle in crypto prices. I've never heard that, but anyway, so it appears that for the last 2 cycles, what do you think the main? I'll let you interpret that one, Lex.
Yeah, I don't have a good intuition on this. I mean, to me, it's kind of astrology. I think people will tell you like technical stories about it, about the price coming in and out. What I think I see, and again, it's really finger in the air, is I think there's a vacillation between the crypto native and institutional story. So it goes Bitcoin, and then it goes not Bitcoin blockchain, and then it goes Ethereum and ICOs, and then it goes no, actually digital assets and tokenization of big finance, and then it goes no, DeFi and NFTs, and then it goes no, that's dead. Now it's central bank digital currencies in China and the US launching it. So I see that kind of dialectic, like a bouncing back between institutional and anarchist. And that's like a political and attention war. And I think the pace of that bouncing between those 2 walls is what to me looks like the 4-year cycle. Like it looks like those are the 2 pieces of the puzzle that it goes between. I'm sure there's lots of other factors. We overlay on top of that the fact that the macro environment didn't change for 15 years, right? So it's a 4-year cycle in a world where interest rates are 0 and everybody gets free money every single year. So that is unhinged. That context is unhinged. But we have the innovation, so you could talk about credit, you could talk about people's discretionary spending and so on. But I've probably said enough wrong things on that already.
Yeah. So the question I had was, you said that in the recent cycle, the NFTs, or rather the DeFi applications, didn't perform as well as the actual Ethereum, the underlying token. And so is there if I'm trying to dream up some, whiz bang application, some DeFi application that's going to sit on top, am I almost, like destined to never be able to perform as well? Is there or is it really just coming down to becoming interesting enough to have enough users using my application that it, there's scarcity and hence people want to use it? Or do you think I'm just destined to never outperform Ether?
Yeah, it's kind of the analogy would be like, I don't want to start Uber because I only want to build Apple.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, not everybody gets to build Apple, right? Not everybody gets to build the layer 1 that wins. Mm-hmm. It's bigger. The opportunity to build the economy is bigger than the opportunity to build the best firm in that economy. Mm-hmm. But just by the kind law of numbers in the world, you're unlikely to be the person to be the first to build the economy and capture all the gains. It's much more likely that you'll be able to build 1 out of thousands of applications that are productive and fruitful, within the economy. And so I think people should work on where there's congruence, where their capabilities and passions overlap with economic opportunity. And I don't think that it's cool to be first and it's great, but it really doesn't matter if your thing is worth 100 billion or 10 billion or 1 billion or 100 million from a personal perspective. So I think managing your risk level and expectations is probably the better approach.
Yeah, sounds good. All right. Well, that's a great answer. So look, thank you very much. That was a really insightful talk. And thank you very much for coming on. Brilliant 100th talk for the meetup. So thank you very much. And I'm now, so you're free to leave now, Lex. I'm going to share my slides, which are the forthcoming talks. Yeah, so see you, Lex. And let's try and find the right, there we go. Okay, everyone. So hopefully everyone can see my slides. And so they're the socials for the meetup. And as well, we've got some talks coming up. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to have Caliban Brown and Everledger talk about what they do in the blockchain space. And just to give people a bit of a feel for what do companies in the blockchain space look like and what do they do. 2 weeks after that, I'm going to talk about Ethereum gas usage and how to optimize your contracts to be more efficient. We've got some lawyers coming on after that to talk about NFTs and copyright and legal implications. And yeah, that's going to be really good. And Mikhail, I hope May 18th works for you, because I know we said, look, we should defer it a bit because of your personal issues, but is May 18th sounding like a reasonably good time?
Yep.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Brilliant. That sounds good. All right. So that sounds good. And then on June the 1st, Adrian is going to tell us all about checkpoint sync, which is something to do, a sync mechanism used in the Ethereum too, so in beacon chain and such like, beacon chain execution chain. And yep, and I still haven't scheduled the Solidity security talk yet, but that is coming up. So thank you everyone again for joining, and have a great day or night. Bye.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Lex. Bye-bye.